Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome back. Now we begin our third session of the day on this hopefully happy Friday. Jummah Mubarak to everyone. This is the 2025 summit that the Bad Lab has organized. I'm your host, Musharraf Zaidi, and this third session is about the economy. We're trying to chart out a path or a way forward for 2025. We're hoping to extract, at least nuggets of optimism and positive ways forward for the coming year. And of course, one of the areas that is vital to any country or society's well-being, maybe elemental to it, is the economy. We talked this morning about Pakistan as a middle power and what opportunities and threats afflict or potentially benefit middle powers in the coming year, 2025. We spent the rest of the morning talking about citizen-state relations, specifically in the context of Pakistan. And now we'll talk a little bit about the prospects for both macro, but also micro level well-being and growth for the Pakistani economy. We have a fantastic panel, as we did in the earlier two sessions. I'm joined most of all because of the distance that you've covered, Khurram. I must thank you for being here. You've come all the way from Karachi for this. I deeply appreciate that. Khurram Hussain, who is a person that doesn't need any introduction, neither in Pakistan nor anywhere else, but when we want to understand what's happening in the economy, we read Khurram Hussain's column in the Dawn. We're joined by Kashmala Kakakhail. Kashmala leads Climate Ventures and is is the climate finance person for this country and frankly for the region. Kashmala brings to the conversation a wealth of experience in the public and private sectors and has spent the last several years focusing on how Pakistan will extract from the climate opportunity benefits for the country and mitigate and adapt to some of the challenges posed by the age of climate change. And we're joined by Tobias Huck. Tobias is a frequent guest on conversations that we have here at the Bad Lab. He's the country economist for Pakistan at the World Bank and is part of the leadership team that covers Pakistan. And we're grateful that Dr. Huck has joined us today. Let's start with you, Khurram. The last few times you and I have had this conversation on this platform, we've talked about default as a potential outcome of the trajectory of the economy at that time. We've also talked a lot about the core deficits and challenges that the economy faces and how unsustainable they seem. And yet, a few months since the last time we spoke on camera, here we are. Those fears seem to have settled down a fair bit. In some ways, that's a great relief. Are we out of the woods is kind of the key question, but more importantly, how did Pakistan exit the woods, if indeed we are out of the woods? And, what were the dynamics or the actors and the players that informed this journey from where we were maybe a year and a half ago to where we are now?
We are not out of the woods by any measure.
Okay.
The only reason we aren't talking about default anymore is because in July 2023, Pakistan did what Pakistan has always done when it comes to the brink of a balance of payments crisis.
Survive?
Pakistan got a bailout from the IMF coupled with a friendly country. From the UN, overnight meaning maybe within a fortnight, Pakistan's foreign exchange reserves doubled. But of course, that was borrowed money.
This was June.
Yeah. Right after the last PDM government had made a complete hash of the IMF program that had begun after a number of false starts. In August 2022, by June of 2023, Mr. Dar had made, as finance minister, after muscling out Miftah Ismail and coming in his place, had made a complete hash of that program, and that's why we were talking about the specter of default. Pakistan's foreign exchange reserves were not sufficient to cover even 1 month's worth of imports at that point in time.
Hence the alarm in our conversation.
Hence the alarm in our conversation. Now, on the back of an IMF program, a standby arrangement that was negotiated and arranged in a real rush, took a lot of us by surprise when it was announced.
Does it remain inexplicable to you? Because that's the word I would use, is that how quickly it came about and how it came about.
No, not really, because we've had standby arrangements come about very quickly in the past too, and that's what they're meant to do. So 2008, that standby arrangement happened pretty quick as well. That's what they are there for. They're there for, it's a very rapid dispersing facility designed to pull a country back from the brink. And that's what it did. It fulfilled its purpose. There were question marks at that point in time whether Pakistan will be able to walk the path of stabilization envisioned in that program. They managed to do so successfully. And keeping to the fiscal targets contained in that program, keeping to the interest rate target, and keeping the exchange rate, not burning foreign exchange reserves to maintain an artificially low exchange rate. These actions helped pull the country back from the brink. And I think from post-February 2024, when the government changed again, the incoming government more or less has maintained those settings, the macroeconomic adjustment settings, and as a result has now managed to get onto a longer-term extended fund facility with the IMF as well, back-to-back fund programs. All of these things have helped pull Pakistan back from the brink, but very quickly Pakistan can find itself back in the same position again if there is a reversal of the policies. If, for example, one more time they start trying to pursue an unrealistic or an artificially low exchange rate, if one more time they decide they want to now boost growth and they want to use the fiscal and forex buffers that have been built up during this painful period to boost growth and pump the engines of growth in the economy, take interest rates much lower, announce amnesty schemes or other schemes for subsidized credit for
You don't
industry.
think on the interest rates that's already happened? Because it's been quite an aggressive sort of strategy.
It has been, but that's also partially understandable because inflation has come down equally aggressively. What I'm concerned about is the clamor from industry to take interest rates into single-digit territories very early. I think precipitous action on rate cuts can trigger instability one more time, already some revival of growth is registering itself on the current account. We've seen a surplus. We've seen, in fact, running surpluses on the current account since July of this fiscal year, which has helped build the foreign exchange buffers for the country. But there is now, a possibility that by February, March, this could begin to taper off and end because imports are beginning to now pick up on the back of sort of a revival of demand within the economy.
Which isn't that different from previous cycles in terms of the pattern.
It's exactly the same.
Tobias, you've been in country. I mean, you're no longer the foreigner that hasn't been here long enough to have not seen a couple of cycles. I think this is your third. Where do you think we are? Is there anything you see about the management of the economy that's different? Are you confident about the quantum of stability that we're seeing right now? Is the realness in any of the numbers that are picking up real enough that this is going to be sustainable? How do you feel generally about where the economy is today?
Yeah, look, I think the recovery the return to stability is real.
Okay.
And I think you've seen government do some quite difficult things to achieve that. You've seen the primary surpluses for the first time. So the fiscal, they've really reduced the spending. They've brought up the revenues. You've seen this backing away from these very destructive interventions with exchange rate policy. I mean, that's not happening any longer. And they are quite carefully progressing with the IMF program. And I think, of course, it's not perfect. But I think in general, they're doing what they need to remain on that program. So then you've seen that with the IMF funding, with the external flows, the rollovers coming in from the friendly countries, you've seen the foreign exchange reserves increase. And so you've seen more a real improvement in market sentiment and a real improvement in confidence in the economy. And that's why you've seen the bond yields come down. I mean, it's very measurable, right? You can kind of price the risk, and you've seen the bond yields come down, and you've seen, you know, some recovery in private sector activity. Now, is that enough for Pakistan? Is that substantially and qualitatively different from previous cycles that we've been in? I would say we don't know yet, right? I would say that we are still in this moment where this is a repeated cycle, where we get into a new IMF program, we get the bailout, we stay in terms of the macroeconomic bounds that the program sets, the political pressures start to rise a little bit, and then at some point in the past, previous cycles, those political pressures have overwhelmed the capacity of government to stay within those bounds. And I don't think we know yet whether government is going to manage those political pressures through a return to some of the very destructive patronage and expansionary policies that we've seen in the past, or they're going to be able to credibly commit to a reform program that offers a real change from the past, a real break from the past. I can say with the counterparts we work with in government, I think a lot of work is being done on the planning, a lot of work is being done to think through what would need to happen to substantially change Pakistan's path. But we're not yet at the point where we can say that that path has been taken, right? So the thinking is happening, the action, let's see.
So before I bring Kashmala in on kind of some of the opportunities, I do want to ask you about the degree to which you worry about the sustainability of this from the, you mentioned kind of confidence, market confidence, and it's look at the stock market or you look at bond yields, and those are really positive indicators. There's no arguing those numbers. Where there is an argument, I think, that a lot of people feel compelled to make is, whilst all of this is happening on the street, on Main Street, Pakistan, that confidence is not echoed. Ordinary people, even though inflation is dramatically slowed, people don't feel that their lives are any better. People don't feel confident in their relationship with the state. People don't feel. But a certain degree of balance, just it doesn't exist, at least from, you know, what one is able to measure anecdotally, because I don't have a scientific tool, but even in our previous conversations today. Does that worry you, or does that worry your colleagues at the bank?
Absolutely. Look, I think this is the problem, right? As we have stabilized, but at a very low equilibrium. We've stabilized at roughly 3% growth rate. Well, the population's growing at more than 2.5%. So basically we've stabilized with incomes where they are. We have stabilized with a 40% poverty rate. We've stabilized with, frankly, a quite severe fiscal austerity by many measures. I mean, the government is just simply not spending enough on health and education. We have terrible human development outcomes. And that's why we can't stay where we are. I can't see macroeconomic stabilization being sustained without that driving insurmountable political pressures and dissatisfaction, quite rightly so. And that's exactly why the next step needs to be taken. We need to move from stabilizing the ship to actually plotting a course towards better growth, not for the sake of macro, not for the sake of the balance of payments. We need to set a path for growth and development so that you can get your poverty rate below 40%, so you can get your stunting rate below 40%, so you can get more kids in school,
women at the workplace, you know,
exactly.
Mobile phones in everybody's hands, you know, fast-moving internet.
And we're not on that path yet.
So let me on that note, Kashmala, I don't know if there's any growth path given the fundamentals have not changed. I think, and I'll come back to you, Khurram, on that question. But Kashmala, one reason why there has been some return to stability is really good luck. The super floods of 2022 didn't reemerge, or there was no reappearance. We haven't had a major catastrophe of that quantum or any quantum since then. We've also had relative stability globally. The genocide in Gaza, or even the situation in Syria has not had the kind of impact on Pakistan that, for example, the change in government in Afghanistan had clearly, or the change of government in Pakistan had. So, to what extent do you feel that a climate event could disrupt the stability? And also, aside from climate events, it seems to me that the one area of good news potentially in terms of financing a lot of our gaps might be the climate finance space, simply because the traditional development finance sources have all dried up. We had Amar Malik sitting here, earlier today, and he talked with a lot of evidence about the fact that the glory days of money being pumped in from DFID or FCDO or from the development banks, the MDBs, a lot of that is gone. So what might be left over in that space might just be the climate finance space.
And that might be a good thing. The fact that we have to start working towards proactively trying to develop a mindset where we're not waiting for a flood or two, which will help us raise financing for addressing the challenges that we have on ground. That's fine. Disasters happen. We need to be equipped. But we also need to be proactive in terms of how we use the climate finance that is available. Yes, absolutely, there's a shift happening from development finance to climate finance. Money is drying up at the global level as well for different reasons that we're all aware of. But when it comes to climate finance, that's also no walk in the park. So yes, it's available, whatever pockets are available, some being retrofitted from development to something that people keep pushing back on, not bringing ODA into climate finance conversation, but that's what's happening, that's the reality on ground. So climate finance as a lifeline, what we're really seeing right now is the countries with larger institutional capacity are the ones that are actually accessing it. And then couple that with the whole debt crisis, and couple that with the vulnerability crisis, the chase that we're having over there, and then of course put in the balancing the development with your climate goals, like what should you do in the mix of all of that. So within that context, where does that leave us? We're now I'd like to, and this is something that I keep talking about, we are really at that point of inflection in Pakistan where local leadership needs to emerge. We don't want the UNs, we don't want.
You can say World Bank. I'll say it. We want to keep working with you, Tobias, but we don't want you.
No,
we don't want to be needed either.
No, let me explain.
Yeah.
We don't want, and this is something that I keep saying at every platform, is really about moving away from the grant recipient mindset.
Yeah.
Let's partner up. We know what we want, the local leadership, there are institutions, we need to, TA is fine, aid is not. We're not interested in aid anymore. Let's focus on how we can create those champions who are able to understand what the international arena is and how you're supposed to access it. Now, let's move on to what I mean about that. We have to be mature about how we design our climate projects. Yes, grant is an instrument, but how do you put it together with, say, equity to blend it and make the grant is good, but how do you blend it with a concessional loan to actually make these climate programs commercially viable to crowd in the private sector? So that's critical. And on top of that, what's really important is for us to understand that we keep talking about policy advocacy internationally, but what we're really missing over there is the word influence, because influence is as critical as finance over here. If you're not in the right rooms, if you're not being able to simplify, as I said, money is being given, or money usually goes to entities that have the ability to design programs the size that they do. Countries like Pakistan need to understand that the solutions to your problems are not just in Pakistan. You have to have the right level of conversation. You have to be at the right level of conversation when it comes to where climate finance is being designed.
And what is the state of play on that front? How's Pakistan doing?
We do a decent job. We take 2 steps forward, 1 backward, which is fine. But we want to now, like I said, local leadership, we need to start focusing on the pockets of opportunities that we have, convene the way, Tabad Lab does a great job of actually putting a few voices together, and then you have a more solid voice in terms of what is it that you want to influence.
Is the architecture of the public sector as it exists conducive to taking advantage of the climate finance opportunity as far as growing our economy is concerned? Because to me, it's not just a matter of getting access to $500 million or getting access to $50 million or $15 million. The question is, can we plug that money into a growth opportunity for the economy that is green, that is at least carbon neutral, if not net carbon positive, that actually creates long-term downstream rents for the Pakistani
Absolutely. So it's a two-way street, right? The public sector has a very different role to play. Then the private sector has a role to play as well, right? The pipeline is not what the government is supposed to design, right? Especially when you're speaking about green transitioning, especially when you're thinking about innovation and about ideas that aren't even born yet, right? So the public sector needs to do what it needs to do, which is facilitate, which is to ensure that Pakistan is not traded for money going to LDCs and SIDS, for example. Oh, because you're a middle income country and then money is scarce, it should go to those countries. Yes, that's the role that the government needs to play, and that's what they play, and they should continue to play. But when it comes to simplification, government needs technical support to understand what the technical simplification is it that we're looking for, right? Because if you don't get into that level of detail, you sit on those seats, you do what you do, and then you come back. So it's not about the $500 million or the whatever it's really about ensuring that the money that's coming through climate finance is actually going to make sense and be absorbed for the pipeline that you're developing by the private sector.
So on that note, Khurram, I think I might be able to predict your immediate answer, but I want you to go into a little more detail if you can. Or let me just start with a proposition rather than a question. It doesn't seem to me that the public sector is equipped to lead or even to participate in a conversation about green transition or circularity. And in a sense, the only avenues for globally relevant and global narrative consistent growth is in those spaces. I don't know if there's a lot of carbon heavy growth that's available to Pakistan for where it's sitting on the totem pole of, for example, manufacturing or even some of its services sector areas of opportunity. Are any of these things, to your mind, in the visible range of public sector decision makers, or are we still so close to what had happened in the summer of 2023 that the kind of out of emergency transition or triage kind of situation is still the prevalent mindset? We have to survive till next quarter, we have to survive till the next IMF tranche release.
Okay, there's actually multiple questions there. Right now, the policy thinking is definitely dominated by surviving the next IMF review. And that's not new, that's not only this time. I mean, Pakistan for the past 3, maybe 4 decades has been basically living from one review to another. We've spent more time inside IMF programs than outside of them over the past 4 decades. So I think in that context, there's probably limited space for climate finance conversation to make an entry. I don't, and your question regarding the public sector, yes, I think the public sector generally is ill-equipped to participate in the kind of conversations Kashmala was talking about. And this is not only on climate finance. I think they've demonstrated that they don't really understand the kind of changes sweeping the world, not just in the climate area, but let's say renewable energy as well, for example. I mean, just as the renewable energy revolution was getting going in the middle of the 2010s, Pakistan was celebrating cutting the ribbon on its first coal-fired power plants, for example, right? And now we're talking about how those power plants have become liabilities and the payments associated with them. Whereas we should be talking about how do we harness the renewable energy revolution sweeping the world, how do we position ourselves to envision zero carbon or a low carbon growth for ourselves in the future, to shift from DFI financing to perhaps climate financing, all these things. I think the public sector is generally basically mired in the old world and is trying to do the best they can to make a go of things within the old way of doing things. which is giant power plants, it's IMF financing, World Bank financing, ADB financing, living off of the multilaterals, for example. So frankly, I'm a bit skeptical about the prospects to undertake the kind of change that Kashmala is talking about.
Tobias, just taking the cue from that, we have seen the emergence of, for example, the SIFC as at least an attempt at an innovative approach to retooling or re-equipping the public sector to have some of these conversations. But I'm not sure that, the investment portfolio that, Pakistan can boast of today is consistent with optimism for 2025 in terms of, the macro indicators. Might we be victims of maybe overemphasizing the pessimism and the trends of the past? I mean, is there a reason for us to be excited about potentially what might be on offer in the near future when it comes to things like FDI and things like renewable energy investments?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think the way you put it was exactly right. I mean, the role for the government in all of this is the enabler. There's a lot of climate finance out there. Pakistan should be accessing much more of the grant financing that's available, of the concessionary financing available. But at the end of the day, Pakistan's transition to a green economy is going to be driven by the private sector. If it's going to happen, it's going to be driven by the private sector. And how are you going to get a private sector that responds to international price signals, that responds to new market opportunities, that responds to the really positive options that are available and the opportunities that are out there? Well, frankly, I don't mean to be boring, but it's a lot of the same stuff, right? You got to set up a macroeconomic situation that is sustainable. You got to invest in human capital. You got to have a private sector environment which makes it easy rather than difficult to do business. You've got to reduce the presence of the state in the economy. You've got to get 200 state-owned enterprises out of the faces of the productive sector businesses that are trying to operate in that space. You've got to reduce your trade restrictions, because what all these things are doing is locking the economy into an old mode of production, an old way of being.
But
I don't just to finish the point, I don't think that the government has the capacity to change that. And I don't think we should be asking the government to change that. I think what we should be saying to the government is, look, get the macro right, stop having such a heavy hand in the economy, and let the amazing Pakistani entrepreneurs who have shown the world so many times over that they can take advantage of opportunities, let them take advantage of these opportunities to transition the economy, to take advantage of the opportunities that green transition presents. And we know those opportunities are out there.
Tobias, I guess just to pretend to be somebody reacting to that, which I'm not, my own views are not important in this conversation, but somebody might turn around and say, well, which of this brilliant private sector do you want to give a free rein to? The same IPPs that kind of, signed these really, I think, draconian sort of deals that extracted rents from this country for 3 decades on? Or would we rather the real estate mafiosos that have dominated policymaking for now going on at least 3 decades in terms of macroeconomic policy? There's a lot that we kind of lionize about the private sector, but rent-seeking behaviors are deeply internalized and normalized in a lot of the big-ticket sort of, capital owners in this country. Are those concerns not valid in terms of government intervention or fears? And how would you advise us to think about them, if not advise the government to do about them?
Look, I think the private sector in every country is profit maximizing, right? If you create a policy environment in which people can generate rents, they can generate political power, they can buy themselves concessions. If you create that kind of environment, you're going to get that kind of private sector, right? I think the examples you identified, the IPP, yes, they're private sector companies, but they're private sector companies taking advantage of a public sector structured contract. You talk about real estate. Well, we know the real estate sector is not taxed anywhere nearly as much as it should be. We know that the whole real estate sector is riven with special interests and regulatory concessions and special interest on the public sector side as well. I think what I'm saying, right, is if we took a across-the-board attempt to create a more even playing field for the private sector, you would find that some of these special interests would have their power and influence reduced, and you would also see that private sector being more responsive to the global opportunities that we're facing, including in some of these areas such as green technology or energy transition.
But let me take this to Khurram real quick. Khurram, if you were to have this kind of, I guess, not to demonize it in any way, but let's call it broadly, and I'm sort of broadly from the same school of thought, this kind of neoliberal off and let the private sector thrive. I'm not sure we want that to happen in every case. So for example, in wheat procurement, which is riven with all kinds of corruption and problems, frankly, but which has over the years sustained a kind of food security in this country that is really now under threat, in part because of what allegedly are essentially impositions from the IMF about, you know, not setting wheat support price in the way that it's been set in the past. How do we think about this in a way that's aligned with, I think, the core principle is that you want the private sector to thrive, you want it to be globally competitive, without creating openings for the entire Pakistani economy to become vulnerable to private sector machinations, either global or domestic, that might cause, for example, food shortages in our country?
Musharraf, about 10 years ago, there would have been a straightforward answer to your question. Not anymore. Okay. I think neoliberal, since you use the word, but that way of thinking about things itself, I think, is now facing huge question marks going into the future, especially with the Trump presidency about to begin, where he's promising trade wars all over again, and this time on an even bigger scale than what he gave us last time. But I think around the world, the global market that came into being in the early 90s or the late 80s, perhaps, wherever you want to sort of situate it, that grew and became the era of what we used to call globalization, as you might remember. And attendant with that, the rise of that global market was the neoliberal thinking that went with it. One way of thinking for the advanced industrial countries, the Washington Consensus for the less developed countries like us. But I think that era is now, the sun is setting on it, and some kind of a neo-mercantilist world order is emerging around us. And I don't think it's a straightforward argument anymore that that the market is the best way to deliver goods. In some areas it is, but like you put your finger on the right example, which is food security. There's a reason why we haven't had a famine in India or Pakistan since the British left, since 1947 till now. And the reason is because the state began to play a very heavy role in the procurement of food, in the storing of food, in the setting the price of food, and prevented the kind of famines that were produced by speculative behavior in food markets prior to, in the colonial era. So there are definitely areas where market thinking needs to perhaps be tempered very, very strongly. Food is a very important one in there, over there. I think maybe energy, maybe another. But again, I think the experts would know more. But nevertheless, what remains a fact is that an economy the size of Pakistan's, a country the size of Pakistan, cannot be run on command. So you can't be going back to a command-based kind of an economy of that sort. You have to have a system for curating the economy, curating the playing field that Tobias talked about. Where the ruler doesn't directly come into the game and try to dictate to the players what kind of contracts they should set, what kind of rates of return they should expect.
But where the ruler is setting the outcome level sort of indicators and saying, just meet these key outcomes.
Either that or the ruler setting the rules of the game.
Sure.
but not calling the shots.
Sure.
Right? That sort of an approach to economic management, I think, has been very, very important from the early 90s. We've not really been able to bring that in. And that's one of the reasons why we have been stuck in this perpetual cycle of booms and busts since then. I think empowering the regulators, for example, is a very important part of this, and then letting them do their job, putting the right people in charge.
Yeah, but if you empower regulators, but then make the chairman of a regulator subservient to a grade 21 sort of,
you're back to square one.
DMG or PAS officer, I think then it's a counterintuitive.
That's what I call performative reform.
Yeah.
Right? It's performative in the sense that, okay, because somebody is asking you to set up an independent central bank, for example. So you do that, you pass the legislation in a hurry through a joint session of Congress. Now you've got legally, on paper, an independent central bank. But you put a central banker in charge who will take that call when it comes from Islamabad.
I wonder what hypothetical example you might be referring to. We'll leave that to the speculation of the viewer or the listener. Kashmala, two things that Khurram has mentioned here I think are really important and central to the climate agenda, both food and energy. And in those spaces, if the argument is, and I'll come back to you, Tobias, on the degree to which it should or shouldn't be market driven, because I do think, for me at least, that's an open question. But, that's your climate agenda. Where's your mind on the degree to which the market should dictate outcomes in this kind of domain? Separately, I want you to talk about, neo-mercantilism and tariff wars from the perspective of climate finance, because I wonder if the climate finance opportunity is very much subject to the moods and whims of this kind of neo-right of center kind of narrative that's emerging in Western Europe and certainly in the US. But first on energy and food and the market.
Absolutely. So it's clear that climate is having an impact on food, right? It's an area we all need to look at very closely. When we say that let the private sector come in, I want to also double down on the private sector a little bit after I complete this thought. What we basically mean is there are two parts to when we say we need to raise climate finance for climate action. Climate action, you are either adapting to the problem, which means improving your flood mechanisms, early warning systems, improving your drought resistant seeds, all of that, or you're actually reducing the impacts of climate change, which is really the mitigation, the green energy, the transition. Since technically there's no revenue generation in the first one, the private sector is not interested in coming into the adaptations field as we stand today, right? Which is why the public sector has to take a lead in that part. It's important that the public, at the provincial level, at the district level, that's an area that they do have to take a lead on.
Because that's all capex.
Because that's all capex. But when we are really talking about is the mitigation, the transition part of it, where we need to have the right enabling space for the private sector to come in. Now, coming to my second thought really around the private sector, it's not a panacea. So we're okay, open the floodgates and they will come and solve the problem, because we are sweeping the entire private sector into one phrase. There is private sector in Pakistan where they own banks themselves and they can fund, there's no issue of liquidity over there. When we're designing, so climate finance comes into a place when you want to talk about concessionality. Why are you using that delta? What's the additionality that you're bringing into the conversation? So you're talking about inculcating a sense of using climate finance to a very different audience. It's not the same IPPs and it's not those big giants that may have to think very differently if they have to come up with climate solutions. So the yes, private sector is about profit maximization. In Pakistan, that's equated to rent seeking, and that's what we want to change. That's what the local leadership and the champions that we're trying and create some space around to say, no, we should stop thinking that it's really private sector is only about rent seeking, but it's about coming up with solutions where you bring in the incentivization that you bring in so that people can innovate. That's the sort of equation we are talking about.
Tobias, is this an unfair sort of juxtaposition, the kind of the free market and open access versus where clearly there are some examples where state intervention and public sector intervention is clearly in the public interest?
Yeah, look, I mean,
Or do you not accept the premise at all of
no,
the
I mean,
public interest?
I think it's the public sector should set the rules, and those rules should encourage and create incentives for the private sector to work in the broader public interest. I think that's the basic framing of modern economics, right? And that means, yes, we should be taxing carbon, right? We should be forcing firms who pollute to pay more or to face regulation. I don't think it's black and white. I don't think anyone is saying we should just let the private sector go crazy and do whatever it wants.
I really wanted you to be able to say that on camera. So that's great, because that's an accusation you have to deal with.
Let me just, I mean, I think the wheat sector is a really good example of this, right? I mean, I have a very different view. I mean, you look at Pakistan's wheat productivity, it's the lowest in South Asia. We have a wheat support price that has done a very bad job of equating supply and demand. We have erratic production, we have erratic import-export, and it's left Pakistan behind in terms of its agricultural productivity. Now, does that mean that the public sector has no role to play in agriculture? Of course we do. I mean, the government should be providing the public goods. It should be providing education to farmers. It should be providing some of the large-scale irrigation potentially. But saying, look, this farmer should produce this amount of crop at this time, we're just not good at that. The government just is not good at that. And the countries that have achieved rapid improvements in agricultural productivity have tended to do so by letting the private sector take a much more active role.
But they've also adopted a directive role in terms of net outputs and food security, right? Like, I mean, to my mind, the best example of this is Brazil and Embrapa. And so Embrapa did all of the things in terms of the productivity and the seed technology and really genuine organic homegrown changes to how they do agriculture and productivity, but that was aligned with a state structure that was very protective of the kind of sovereignty domain vis-a-vis food security. I guess from a nationalist Pakistani perspective, you're saying you should get from point A to point B in a Bentley or a Rolls Royce, and I'm saying we're never going to have a Bentley or a Rolls Royce. Here's a Suzuki Alto or maybe a CD70 or maybe some
right.
Qingqi, some Chinese, hopefully Chinese vehicle. And we're getting from point A to point B, which is national food security. And so, yeah, there's a lot of inefficiencies. I think PASCO's a disaster. And God help us the day that, you know, whatever happens, that eventually will happen with PASCO happens. But at a minimum, it's that structure, the wheat support price, is enabling a degree of food security that is vital to Pakistan.
You can import wheat. You can import many food products. And if people have sufficient income, if you have a social protection system in place, people will be able to pay for food. I don't think that protecting food security is necessarily the same as having a command and control system in agricultural production.
I think when you watch...
And very few countries do this, right? I mean, very few countries say, look, we need to produce the food that we consume. Many countries are net food exporters, many countries are net food importers.
Yeah, but a lot of those countries aren't surrounded by an extremist religious regime to the west, to the northwest, and to the east. And a communist regime to the north. I think this is a unique... It's okay for Pakistan, in my mind, to have unique policy formulations where it's the only one standing because it's a unique country. But let's come back to this. Khurram, do you have a different view on any of this, or are you aligned mostly with Tobias?
I mean, I get where Tobias is coming from. And substantially, yes, I would agree that to some, you know, it's not a question of there should be no market and the agriculture sector should be command driven. I don't think anyone wants to make that argument. And nobody, I don't think, wants to make the argument that it should be completely market driven either. Getting that mix right is really what it's all about. And to that extent, you know, we can borrow lessons from other countries, but I think in substantial measure, that's our job to find here in Pakistan. Because, you know, the poverty profile is different from one country to another. The levels of access to food between urban and rural areas, these profiles will differ from one country to the next. What mix of policies you use to address the food security of your people is going to vary from one country to the next. All countries do take measures to protect the agriculture sector, right? And a lot of countries have very large subsidy regimes running for their agriculture sectors. I don't know what the ideal mix would be for Pakistan, but I don't envision a purely market-determined outcome. I don't think it can any longer be argued that the market can save us or provide us the kind of outcomes you're looking for, not in this day and age.
So I think
Not
we're looking
anymore.
in this example, we're really looking at kind of two poles where nobody's arguing for either pole. And the argument really is the degree of calibration between one or the other. And I think it's fine to have different views on the panel. That's why it's a fun panel. I don't know if there's much use in prosecuting that topic much further. I do think it's a point of maybe departure, at some stage, certainly between me and Tobias, and perhaps the government and the bank as well. I think the thing that hopefully some folks that are watching have tuned in for is for like a look forward to 2025. And we've already pointed to a few things, but as we kind of move towards wrapping up the conversation, I wonder if I could ask all three of you to comment on the prospect for growth, because from the collection of comments you've made, it sounds almost to me like if you value stability and the kind of not good times, but not really bad times, stay the course and don't try to grow. That's what I heard. I might be wrong, but maybe starting with you, Khurram, are you really suggesting that this country should not seek to grow?
I think it should seek to grow, but not the way it has done it in the past.
Okay, talk more about that.
Don't try and grow by bringing in borrowed liquidity from abroad and throwing that into your money markets at home in order to spur consumption. And because that ends up driving up the trade deficit, it ends up throwing your monetary aggregates completely out of whack. With the net result that it depletes your foreign exchange reserves, it spurs inflation, and you'll end up back in the middle of a balance of payments crisis. Don't repeat that story one more time.
Okay.
However, where they're standing right now, it's a place of stability for sure, but they cannot stay here for very long. The ground beneath their feet, I'm talking about the government here, the ground beneath their feet is getting hot, very hot. 2 million estimated new entrants are being added to the labor force every year. That means the economy better be creating at least 2 million new jobs every year in order to be able to at least maintain a modicum of stability. If it doesn't do, I'm talking social stability. So if it doesn't do that, then you have economic stability at the cost of social stability. And they can't stay here for very long. They've got to find a way to grow the economy. And my fear is that all these trips that they're making to Saudi Arabia, for example, that's sending the wrong signal. It's to me coming across like they are desperately going around the world in search of the liquidity with which to finance the next growth spurt. So they can turn to and I think to some extent they've also bargained.
Is it to finance the next growth spurt? Sorry to cut in, but is it to finance the next growth spurt, which maybe I can live with, or is it to finance the next spurt of debt servicing and existing burdens? Because to me, there's a difference.
Let's put it this way: it's to finance the next burst of consumption, right? Which will look like growth. And it will register itself as GDP growth, but it is fundamentally basically consumption. That makes people feel good. They're bargaining to some extent that it will help break the PTI and the Imran Khan fever, gripping the electorate. I don't know, maybe not. But in any case, it will certainly lead to the same outcomes that it has done every single other time that they've done this. Since the year 2000 till now, we've had 3 growth spurts. Each one has been financed by foreign liquidity. Each one was shorter than the one that came before. Each one was left a bigger balance of payments crisis than the one that came before. And each one was less intense. It peaked lower than the one that came before. So if we peaked at 9% in 2004, we peaked at something like 6% in 2016, or maybe 7% growth rate in 2016, 17. And then we peaked barely at about 6%. And that was
2022.
2021, 22. And that was considered like a huge victory, unprecedented, blah, blah, blah. Now, if you want to do that, repeat that story one more time.
3.5%, 4% maybe, yeah.
Maybe 4, maybe 5%, and you're back to talking about default all over again.
But here's the policymaker's dilemma, Kashmala. The question here, in the way that often our conversations frame it, it's like, don't do it like this again because, you know, you'll only get, let's say 5% this time and 4% the next time. But I suspect for the policymaker or the decision maker, the question is, don't grow at all or grow at a lesser rate. And don't grow at all or grow the wrong way, you know, consumption driven, the same way as before. When it's a stark binary between kind of holding firm when the ground beneath is moving and getting hotter, and the impulse is to do something, that something will always default to, let's just grow the way we know best. Is there a risk in 2025 of that happening? Let me frame it differently.
Yes.
Let me propose. I don't think this country's decision makers or the federal and provincial bureaucracy or the political decision makers or the military leadership have a playbook that can do any better than repeat previous cycles. And this time they'll get about 4.5% if they hit a real home run. So they'll exceed the projections and they'll get about 4.5%. And of course, that'll do all of the things that we're worried about, you know, that doing, but it will invariably shorten the cycle and shrink the next growth spurt. Is that formulation inaccurate?
That's very accurate. That's the reality. But let's bring in, again, because I'll bring in what I understand, which is the climate world. That's a reality. We'll just take, again, 2 steps forward. We're comfortable, things are good, we're consuming, there's people at the malls, people are sitting in restaurants, it looks like the economy is doing well, exactly the sort of things that
Ramzan and Eid shopping are off the charts.
Looking at the wrong indicators,
Sure.
let's put it that way, right? Those are the things that we pick up and say, look, boom, right? Climate finance is an opportunity that we have yet to understand, right? It's not your standard budgetary support that you think you can raise from one friendly country or another, which ultimately, it's interesting you mentioned the 2 million people that are coming into the workforce. The government should not be in the business of providing employment. I'll give you one example and I'll go back to my how we're not understanding climate finance properly and how we should going forward. The federal government employees currently, officer staff or whatever they call it, is 28,000 people. Support staff, 550,000, right? What equation are we looking at? So the same support is coming in to fund, because this is real, these are salaries you need to pay, this is pensions you need to pay ultimately. So what are we ballooning? The government shouldn't be in the business now, especially in this day and age with technology and whatever, what have you. How much support do you need from additional people to run the government and the sort of money that you bring in? Coming back and wrapping up really from a climate finance perspective is, usually countries come and invest in the banks, multilaterals, bilaterals will come in a country which is obviously financially, economically stable. But the moment you look at the climate finance, you have a case there where you are very clear about your vulnerability. You are transparent about the impacts that you're having to deal with given whatever the situation is. So you don't have to pretend that you're going in the right direction. But what you're saying is, look, we are in a real situation. Here is the additionality, and this is where it's going to go into. It's not some random budgetary support that will go into whatever we know will go into. So it's really, first of all, to understand that, try and be transparent about where your vulnerabilities are, but really also step up your own game. If I'm talking about local leadership, it actually needs to emerge. It's not that you will go and cry about your vulnerability and yes, money will be raised. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about being real about where your economy is, being real about the impact that it's having on you, and how you smartly use the additionality of climate. We can speak about climate debt swaps, for example, just one example. Well, how do you use that smartly to be able to not be pulled down just by your vulnerability and show to the world that everything is right?
Well, I mean, there do seem to be some sort of positive signals. There's the finance minister seems to be really engaged with the idea of panda bonds. There is some degree of green financing conversation, both in the public and the private sector. There are the beginnings of some sort of a domestic conversation. Is it enough, do you think, in 2025 that we'll begin to see some returns on these conversations? Or do you think it's too early?
Returns, no, but better understanding, yes. So launching a bond, yes, we did a great job. I think we've done one with Babda. We were able to raise 500 mil. That's great. But to replicate that and to do it for the sectors that we need to be looking at, I feel the kind of conversations we're having in the government and outside it are just at incrementally increasing their understanding of what's out there.
Yeah.
Return, we'll have to wait a little longer.
Tobias, part of the problem in this space is, of course, that there aren't a lot of templates. This is all very new everywhere. So when we think about, for example, bonds, one thing that a lot of people now talk about is bonds in which the returns are, where carbon is built into the returns, right? So that it's not just a rate of return on the bond, there's also some sort of a carbon credit type internalization into the rates. These kinds of things have been attempted at very small scale by really much smaller countries. I think the small island nation states are the ones where I think they have both the freedom and the scale, being small enough that, if they try it and they fail, it's not going to be a definitive change in the global conversation. Even I think Sri Lanka might be the biggest of all the countries that could get away with that. But Pakistan is way too big, it seems to me, to try and fail. And so when Pakistan does adopt some of these tools, it has to try and succeed. Otherwise, it's lights out really for many other countries. In that way, Pakistan is kind of an exemplar. Do you have the sense that, in the coming year, that we might see good news about the degree to which Pakistan might set an example and lead the way on some of these instruments?
I mean, look, I think that innovation, there's space for green financing. I mean, we're working with the government on options they're developing their green taxonomy, which is intended to attract private investment and climate-friendly areas. I think there is scope for some of these debt environment swaps, debt social swaps, and there's much more that can be done on green financing, carbon pricing, setting up the institutional basis for participation in global carbon markets. So I think that innovation is really it's great. I think that anything that Pakistan can do is sure to be noticed and is sure to going to contribute. I think I'm going to repeat, at risk of repeating myself. I think that that needs to happen alongside some of the broader measures to return confidence to the economy, to show that the debt is on a sustainable path, that the macro is on a sustainable path. If you have that broader context within which there's confidence, and which government is perceived to be a macro manager, and which there's a medium-term trajectory, you're going to create more space for that kind of productive innovation, and the potential benefits of that are going to be magnified as well. So I think it's a dual path. Get the basics right, do some of the innovation and the exciting stuff. Don't think the exciting stuff is going to get you away from having to do the basic work.
I mean, exciting maybe for me and perhaps for Kashmala, but I think there's genuine nervousness in the public sector about some of these tools because of the capacity gaps and also because of the absence of templates. I think Pakistan is probably very good at what Lant Pritchard calls isomorphic mimicry. You know, somebody did this at this time in this country, and therefore you should do it. Great, Pakistan's on board. But you know, you ask Pakistan or the Pakistani elite to kind of lead the way on a new methodology or new paradigm of financing, investments at scale in mitigation or adaptation. And I think there's genuine nervousness about, well, do we know what we're doing? On that, Tobias, I want to ask you, maybe put you on the spot a little bit, or maybe a lot, but I am looking for kind of a generic kind of bullish or bearish sentiment for 2025. Do you think that the challenges, the way that we framed them in this conversation, let me tell you why I'm trying to push the envelope and try and force a response on this. When Khurram and I were having some of the conversations we did, especially in 2023, it really felt like it was assured that, we were on a very bad path. And we've kind of come back from that. So isn't it also possible that we might surprise, each other? But I do want to get this, because like I was saying, there's a real, I think, an element of surprise if we allow ourselves to be surprised that the country came back essentially from the brink of default. Is it not possible that it can also now forge ahead with some measure of sustainable growth in this coming year? Because it is a make or break year. We're either going to repeat the follies of the past and go back into that cycle, or maybe stay where we are, or forge ahead on a new path. So your degree of optimism or pessimism, depending on which?
No, look, I think this year is going to be so uncertain, both in terms of what's happening in Pakistan, but globally as well. I think we all know that, right? And with the change in administration in the US, potential changes in global trade policy, what's going to happen to global interest rates, global growth. There's just so much uncertainty. And so I can't really make a prediction because it's uncertainty upon uncertainty. But what I would say is that we basically have a choice. And I think it's exactly what Khurram laid out. We are on the path of the cycle. We're on that arc of the cycle that we've been on before. And we have a choice. We basically take this fiscal space that's generated and we blow it on consumption, and we return ourselves to where we were the past 24 IMF programs. Or we say, look, there is only really one way to deal with this kind of global uncertainty. That's to build up the buffers. That's to make ourselves as robust and sustainable as we can be. And the only way we can reconcile that kind of macro sustainability, that macro robustness, with actually improving living standards for people, is to do some of the difficult stuff that we've just never been able to pull ourselves together to do in the past. And those things are very well known. It's the trade reform, it's the state-owned enterprise reform, it's the energy sector reform, it's the getting health and education services working. So I would...
Where's taxation of the elite?
Hugely important.
On that list.
Hugely important.
Okay,
because
you didn't mention it, and I didn't want to.
No. This is this, and to be fair to the government, this is very clearly part of their program. They are saying that we need to move away from this system that is very narrow and has a very small number of taxpayers that pay very high rates, and we're missing out on those really at the top of the distribution. To saying that the large-scale agriculturalists, the landowners, the real estate magnates, they need to pay their share. And we need to have a tax system that catches people. And if you're in the net, you should be paying. And I think that, as I say, right, I think that the government's doing a lot of work. It's doing a lot of planning. Let's make it this year that those plans turn into a reality that sees that vision achieved, right? So
in 30 years of following this, I've seen lots of governments indicate seriousness and resolve, with some really serious people doing it. I want to be fair. The finance ministry is one place where, by and large, there haven't been clowns that have been in charge. It's real people that understand these challenges, and at least on the surface seem to want to make those changes. But it never has quite turned. And given that's a quarter-century mark of this century, the idea of 21st century, it's old now, like it's a quarter century old. So I just, there's a degree, at least at my age, I feel a degree of fatigue with a lot of the unfulfilled potential. Khurram, I want you to also take maybe a bullish or bearish view on the likelihood of some of this coming to fruition. But before you do that, I also want you to comment on the degree to which you think the Trump tariff war that's coming might create opportunities for middle power countries like Pakistan with the kind of unique positioning that they have. Is it just going to be opportunity that Vietnam and India run away with? Or are there openings for a country like Pakistan?
I don't know, in response to your second question. And I think anyone who gives a confident answer to that question doesn't know either. I don't think anyone knows what's going to happen when, if and when Mr. Trump launches his trade wars. And I think this is something that's structural, it's here to stay. I don't think it's a case of one guy who accidentally got into the White House with some bizarre ideas. I think we're looking at the United States sort of flailing around and trying to find a strategy with which to deal with an emerging power on the world stage and being unable to find the right strategy. And I think with the passage of time, these impulses, these reflexes to keep coming back to a sort of a mercantilist, an aggressive mercantilism of sorts, are going to increase.
Yeah.
We'll see more trade wars, we'll see wider applications of sanctions laws. So I think what kind of a world will emerge, what kind of opportunities will it will present, what kind of challenges it will pose, this is like right now a wide open field. One thing I'm reasonably sure of is that here in Pakistan, there will be a spirited search for the kind of geopolitical rents that such a world may create. More so than the economic opportunities that it would. That's what happened when the age of globalization opened up, right? They continued searching for geopolitical rents throughout the 1990s, while sitting out the emergence of and the making of a global market that India and China and countries like Vietnam and Malaysia, Indonesia, and so many other countries very effectively tapped into and drew a great deal of benefit from. I think something like that those reflexes are still very much there in government. They will guide the country in the new world that is now opening up before us. And I can't be sure that this is going to be a good story for Pakistan necessarily. You asked about bullish or bearish for the forthcoming year. I'm bearish on it for the simple reason that the country needs to grow. There's no doubt about that. It cannot stay in a moribund state of stability for very long. But it can't grow on the back of a liquidity injection. And if it were to grow through reforms, then we should be seeing that kind of work being done right now as we speak. But we'll not. And the one big thing that they tried to do in this government was the privatization of PIA, and it's all, how that turned out, we both know. And now they're stuck in this situation where they're holding on to this asset that they can't carry, but they can't seem to offload either.
Well, apparently they were going to start seizing people's cell phones coming off international flights, so I think that's also a big reform.
Absolutely. I mean, the reflexes I'm seeing in operation right now are basically sort of doubling down and intensifying the existing bases of revenue, of wherever the state has a handle on things. I'm not seeing any thinking within government or anyone advising government on how to maybe bring about the kind of changes that are required to be the basis for next year's growth. I think absent that thinking, it's futile to expect and hope.
So bearish without saying so for Tobias, bearish by saying so for Khurram. The floodlights are on you, Kashmir.
So let's zoom out. Let's look at the international landscape with Trump coming in. We know what he did to the climate agreement when he came in 2016. He pulled out, a year after the Paris Agreement was signed, which was a big deal, getting all countries, 194 countries to sign a climate agreement. He pulled out. That was the first thing he did. But where did that leave the world? It was slightly different than where it left the world when the US pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol about 7-8 years prior. US was one of the key superpowers at the time. When the US pulled back, everybody pulled out. In 2016, we didn't see that happen. When the US pulled out, we saw China and Europe sort of taking some leadership role and saying we have to continue this. Agreement must go on, the rule book will be written, we will move towards the implementation of what this agreement looks like, because there was a 5-year window between 2015 and 2020 when the rule book was being written, the global rule book was being written. So that continued. Where am I on the situation now with Trump coming back in, and we all know how he feels about what it is, but I don't know, maybe I missed it. He wasn't very vocal about how he feels about pulling out of things this time around, but it may not be as bad as it was maybe first in 2012, 11, and then of course what we saw in 16 and now in 25. The color will be different. We're not too negative on it because there are it's a reality now. The shift is a reality. It's not about whether there are naysayers or people thinking this is just a hoax, or, you know, we've moved past that thinking on climate. So it's real, it's here, carbon budget and carbon space is limited, and we need to do something about it. So we will see that, I mean, there's that positivity around what the globe will do to come together to try and solve this problem. Yes. And there will be some wrinkles in how we go forward, but I think globally it will go on, it will continue.
The climate architecture will stay in place.
Will stay how, I mean, yes, how it will oscillate, but it will stay.
Okay.
Right? When it comes to Pakistan, I think I'm going to say what I said earlier in slightly different words. Climate is an afterthought for everyone over here. Oh, there's funding available, let's put something together, but it didn't work because you didn't give it the oxygen that you were supposed to give it. Because it's enough, you know, and they say, oh, these things don't work, oh, these startups don't work, innovation doesn't work, the technology doesn't work, because that's not what your goal is. You're not focusing on it the way that you should be focusing on. So really, there are glimmers, there are opportunities coming in, but the idea should not be to think about, oh, there's money, let me design a program for it, but here is my program, I'm going to go out and find money for it.
That sounds like it's bearish also. I'll take the bullish position just to wrap up and say that the most optimistic and positive thing I heard, and I think there was consensus on this, is that Pakistan does not have the option of not growing. Now, the downside risk on that is that it's going to seek to grow in a manner that's all too familiar and all too destructive for the people of this country, all 250 million, but in particular, the half of the country that was born in 1998 or later. And these young people deserve growth strategies that are sustainable. I think that we're going to wrap up the conversation on that inspired note of derived optimism. And I will once again thank sincerely and profusely Dr. Tobias Haq, Kashmala Kakakhil, and Khurram Hussain, in particular Khurram, for the long journey you made to participate in this. I hope that as seriously as the first conversation we had about this, the default conversation, which I know was impactful in many ways, I hope that the warnings from this conversation are taken at least as seriously. I do think this country can and will do better than it has in recent times, inshallah. On that note, thank you again for joining us. This marks the conclusion of the panels segment of our day, and the 2025 summit will continue at 5 p.m. Pakistan time with former Prime Minister Shahid Khaqan Abbasi and I engaging in a conversation about what the coming year might look like and how Pakistan wins in this coming year. So with that, thank you once again, and Khuda Hafiz.